So this is the second lecture in Anthropology 321, Diversity and Multiculturalism in Asia, 3 case studies. A little bit to just get the course started. It is called the Anthropology of Asia, and I'm an anthropologist as your instructor. And anthropology is the study of human diversity, the study of the human condition. It includes a range of different subfields, one of which is known as cultural anthropology. And this course is focused on the cultural anthropology of Asia, which really means it's a study of the human cultural diversity in the Asian region, right? So you could have an anthropology of Africa, an anthropology of Europe, an anthropology of Latin America. And this does fulfill the general education requirements for the university, in particular for global studies. We do have this goal of educating citizens in terms of the earth, we do have this goal of educating a global citizen who is educated about global communities, who is educated about communities both abroad, but also in a world of migration, right? Also, those people who migrate, right, from global communities to our own from Asia. And in the United States, as we know, multiculturalism is still controversial. This is actually a controversial goal, if you will. Just recently, even in Idaho, they are trying to pare back some of the diversity curriculum. But I think most of us today agree with this goal for general education, that learning about other communities is a way of understanding all, of our humanity, quite literally. It's a way of building, right, a healthier world, more cooperative world. Now, in the United States, we once pursued a policy of assimilation. And within the politics of the moment, there seems to be still a kind of paradigm swing, right, between widening of acceptance for multiculturalism and a range of voices, and then the pendulum seems to swing back, right, to limits on the expression of diverse identities and a movement towards a policy of assimilation. Indeed, in the university, just like our K through 12, the focus of formal education really has shifted from a policy of assimilation to one of recognizing linguistic and cultural diversity, and then those challenges, right, from society to it. And this is all really relevant as we begin to study Asia, because in many ways, Asia is a concept, or it's a construction of particular groups of people at a particular moment of time that's expanded and become dominant throughout the whole world. So the term Asia really does come from our Greek and Latin roots, and it really meant to the east. So it really meant to the east of the Mediterranean region. And if we think about the historical approaches to the study of Asia, very rarely did they contain all of what people in earlier historical periods would have referred to as Asia. Now, today, we would include the Middle East, including areas of Southwest Asia, as part of Asia, even though rarely would you see that in any kind of Asian studies coursework, any kind of Asian studies courses. It's kind of one of these contradictions that we see when we start to think about how we approach the study of Asia, the terms that we're using, and so on. Generally, Asia has been used to refer to East Asia, a particular part of the Asian region. So this kind of builds on the Greek and Latin understandings, but it's also in some ways it's in contradiction with them. Today, Asia can be delimited from the Europe. Really, there's the continent of Eurasia, and then there's these two geographical regions, Europe to the west, right, and Asia to the east. but there's really no particular boundary here. The boundaries are fairly conventional. So some people will use the Ural Mountains in Russia. So in Russian-speaking parts of the world, there's the idea of European Russia and Asian Russia. And so you will have this particular kind of conceptualization. But other people will also use areas like Turkey as a boundary between Europe and Asia itself. But there really simply is no particular line, right, on this continent that is a objective boundary between two different entities. It's really one that's been constructed in history, right, through the ancient world of the Roman Empire and the other major states and major empires of the world. And with European expansion throughout the globe and the colonization of many areas of the world, including Asia, often Asian studies began to focus on those East Asian states such as China, Japan, and India. So when I first came here to EWU, this class was originally entitled Major Civilizations of Asia, and the societies, Japan, China, and India, that were discussed were really focused on because they were considered to be sort of like the West in terms of being civilized, as being well-developed countries with elaborate and sophisticated culture, with writing systems and so on. And that was pretty surprising for me in my training, because that's not how I approach this particular region. If you were to ask me to do a survey of Asia, I mean, one of the first things that we have to understand is there's a lot of different regions that are really internal to what we think of as Asia, as in the terms that we've been discussing here. So we can talk about North Asia, an area like Russia. We can talk about Central Asia, often conceptualized as the former Soviet states like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. We can talk about the Southwest Asian studies like Iraq and Iran and so on. We can talk about South Asian studies in terms of Pakistan and India. And we can talk about Southeast Asia, all of which are very, very different regions, both in the kind of physical geography and human geography understandings. So I think the bottom line when we start a course like this, when we start thinking about Asia, what do we mean by Asia? We're talking about a very large region that is incredibly diverse, that as people, let's say in the United States here, as our understanding has grown about this region, I think we are much less inclined to do a simplistic kind of rendering of, let's say, what culture is like in Asia, or to highlight, let's say, some developed cultures of the region. I think it's much more important for students to have a richer understanding of the diversity of the region. And in this particular lecture, I'll talk about why I believe that is the case. National identity and diversity is one of the reasons. So here you have an image, a publicity image from the Association for Southeast Asian Nations that is having a meeting. And you can see the leaders, right, of those states there, and behind them you have the individual, right, flags of the countries that they represent. And some Asian nation states have developed a very robust national identity. That identity may be based on some kind of racial concept, it may be based on some ethnic concept. And in fact, many Asian studies courses really drew upon those representations. So if I was to talk about the courses that I was just referring to, or the countries that used to be focused upon in this particular class, right? The idea of Japan, the idea of China, the idea of India. Well, rather than, let's just say, not thinking critically about what we mean by those entities, it's easy to take a simplistic understanding. You have India for the Indians, you have China for the Chinese, you have Japan for the Japanese. And the national identities that have been built, right, lead one to think in that way about people in the region. But here we are in an anthropology class, in a social science class, and we are being asked to think more critically, right, about these terms, about the particular countries in question that we're going to be looking at this quarter. As we have said, Asian societies are very diverse. The most obvious diversity we can think about are indigenous groups, indigenous to the territory, who may have been there before the establishment of those states in question. We may be talking about ethnic minorities in the countries in question. But we also have groups that have taken form through global integration, through things like immigration, through cross-cultural relationships between peoples as well. Asian societies are diverse. And so this course is going to try to go beyond, let's say, just looking at the culture of the majority ethnic groups of these countries. We're going to try to go beyond, let's say, some of the representations of the majority ethnic groups and the culture which they identify with in local kinds of nationalisms, to really understand the human diversity of Asia. In some ways, the national identities can be obstacles to understanding the richer human diversity on the ground. Another reason to be thinking about taking a different approach here is that many groups that are internal to these societies are involved in highly unequal social relationships and political relationships. And in fact, we're in a period of time where there are great minority claims to power and claims to political authority that we would be doing a disservice to, and we would be disadvantaging, right, by focusing on the ethnic majorities and the ethnicity and nationalism that they're often focused upon. Many minorities in these kind of non-majority groups that we've just talked about find themselves in a subordinate or disadvantaged position to majorities. And here you have a number of different representatives from ethnic minority groups in China meeting with Xi Jinping, the president of the country. Well, understanding minority experience really entails looking beyond what states have said about that experience, and often entails drawing on Asian regional organizations as well as international organizations like the UN, who are talking about issues of multiculturalism and cultural rights for people in the region. Now, among these groups, right, multiculturalists in particular, call for more attention to minority issues in education. And so in some ways, we are allying ourselves here in this approach, in this course, with an international organization like the UN and with regional organizations that are working for cultural rights for minority groups. There is also a political philosophical background to the approach that we're taking. Will Kimlicka, who is the author of your reading for this first part of the course, is a political philosopher who's interested in these kinds of rights-related issues in terms of human diversity, in terms of the rights of minority cultural groups, and for multiculturalism. So what is this idea? We hear a lot about it. We have a multicultural center on campus. What do we mean? And that's what Kimlicka does, is he gives us some background on the political and philosophical implications, right, of thinking in terms of multiculturalism. And what Kimlicka is going to argue is that if we were to boil down, in a way, multiculturalism, it's really the idea that individuals, but also groups, cultural groups in a society, also have inalienable rights. So we may be very familiar with the idea that individuals have such rights, but the idea of cultural groups in a society having inalienable rights to those basic qualities, right, we associate with our own society: liberty, equality, justice. What he's making the argument for, right, is that multiculturalism in this sense is philosophical, but it's also a legal and institutional framework for understanding and empowering minority peoples. And so as he moves beyond, let's say, the purely philosophical, that is the celebrate diversity kind of perspective, to the fact that it's also a legal and institutional framework that has its origins in Western countries, what Kimlik is going to argue is that it's actually a question whether or not this multicultural perspective is appropriate for the study of Asia. So that's despite the fact that there is the UN talking about multiculturalism in Asia and regional organizations using the concept of multiculturalism. From his point as or perspective as a professional political philosopher, he's going to make the argument that it is an open question whether this is applicable and whether it's appropriate to be applied to Asian societies. And he doesn't say this because he's trying to make the argument that Asian societies are not diverse. No. He would agree that Asian societies are diverse, but that they have different histories from those countries in which multiculturalism developed. They have different kinds of relationships between both individuals on the one hand, and we might say the legal and institutional framework that supplies rights to those individuals, and different kinds of groups, right? And thus those legal and institutional frameworks that protect rights for groups. In Asia, it's different. There's different worldviews, and so it's likely in Kimlicka's viewpoint that no, it would not be appropriate to apply, right, this perspective to all situations in Asia. And this is going to guide us this quarter. Both on the one hand, the idea that many anthropologists and others are advocating, right, for a multicultural perspective on Asia, while at the same time, right, we have a political philosopher like Will Kimlicka who's questioning this and posing the issue that rather than accepting that framework wholeheartedly, we need to be critical thinkers and we need to be critically reflecting on its applicability. And so that's what we're going to do throughout the quarter. Rather than just talking about, let's say, Asia in these big, broad terms, we are going to be disaggregating the region. We're going to be looking at sub-regions, and we're going to be looking at case studies, individual countries from those regions. So we talked about South Asia, countries like Pakistan and Bhutan and so on. And we're going to be looking in that region at India. Now, India is really interesting. It was formerly an Islamic federated state, but is now a federal parliamentary democratic republic. At the same time, it has a rising territorial Hindu nationalism. So it had its origins, could say early modern origins as an Islamic federated state, but it's not a federated state in the same sense anymore. It is now a democratic republic, even though it has this Hindu nationalism. And so while scholars have recognized that there's been a high level of engagement with multicultural thinking in India, scholars today are starting to question the way that the Hindu nationalism, rising importance and significance and acceptance of Hindu nationalism in India, the way that this is affecting minority rights movements, the way it's affecting the development of multiculturalism in India. After looking at South Asia in the case study of India, we're going to turn our attention to Southeast Asia, so countries like Laos and Vietnam and so on. And for this unit of the course, we're going to look at the country of Thailand. Now, like India in a way, Thailand was formerly a decentralized protectorate. So it was also an area that brought many different political entities into one unit. But in modern history, Thailand has moved to a constitutional monarchy. So it is no longer a kind of decentralized protectorate of many different units, but it is a constitutional monarchy with a king, and the state has a policy of Thaiification. That is to develop a Thai national identity among the citizens of the country. So today, scholars are really questioning Thailand's commitment to multiculturalism, that rather than pursuing multicultural policies, that Thailand is pursuing a nationalist policy of Thai national identity. And then for our final case study, we're going to look at East Asia, and then we'll look at the People's Republic of China. And like these other cases, these are countries that are going through a lot of rapid change. And so China would have been once an absolute monarchy, but it is now a one-party socialist republic. Scholars today, like for the other countries in question, are also raising many questions about how ethnic minorities are integrated into the People's Republic, as well as systematic discrimination and exclusion of minorities in the country. So to conclude, as you can see here, Asia as a concept, right, is a very fuzzy and ambiguous category. Huge area, half the area of Eurasia, no particular boundaries. It's fuzzy and ambiguous in that sense, where it begins and ends and so on. And then once we kind of move internally to it, right, it has lots of different subregions with different cultural backgrounds, different ethnic groups, and so on. And so each of these regions, each of these countries is taking kind of different approaches to the diversity within its borders. And the approaches that we see in the region do raise questions about the application of Western ideas about multiculturalism, that cultural groups have rights, right? This kind of what we were saying, Kimlicka would say, is a basic notion of multiculturalism. Why does EWU have a multicultural student center? Because individual students have rights on campus, but so do cultural groups. African American groups have rights on campus. Other cultural groups have rights on campus, and the Multicultural Center is a way of expressing those rights. But once we start turning our attention, right, to the, as Kimlicka says, the histories of these countries in the region, the ongoing, complex, and changing social relations, the way that these countries think about diversity and minority cultural groups presents very big challenges to the way that we think about the rights of minority groups. And this is really the heart of the course this quarter. And what you see there in this particular image is a kind of a publicity image from Malaysia. And Malaysia is a pluralist state. So it's a state that is not, despite its name, Malaysia, the land of the Malay, it actually celebrates three major groups. It does celebrate other groups as well, but it often, in its publicity materials, celebrates three major ethnic groups in the country, kind of from left to right: the Han Chinese population of Malaysia, the Malay population of Malaysia, and then the Tamil population, all important to Malaysian identity. And sort of gets at this very issue, right? Here's this publicity image of Malaysia that represents three of the larger cultural groups in the country, but the many dozens of other groups, right, are not represented in that picture, are not seen to be kind of quintessentially important, right, for Malaysian national identity. And this phenomena is one we will be exploring this quarter.